She's your plus one? Dominic Hale didn't even look up from his cufflinks. Don't start, Reed. But Reed Calloway was already laughing, the low, private kind that moves through a room like a current. He leaned against the doorframe of the executive suite, bourbon in hand, and looked at Nora standing in the hallway with her sensible shoes and her too large blazer and the small notebook she always carried even when there was nowhere to take notes. And he laughed until his shoulders shook. You brought your secretary to the Aldridge board dinner. He said it slowly, like he was reading it off a sign. Dominic, the woman files your expense reports. Nora looked at the carpet. Dominic finally turned from the mirror. He looked at her, one flat, assessing second, and said, You'll do. Then he walked past her through the door without holding it open. She caught it with her palm before it hit her face. That was the moment. That was the one she would think about later, not with bitterness, but with the clean, clarifying focus of someone who has just been handed the exact information they needed. If you know what it feels like to be looked through by someone who was supposed to see you, stay with me. Because what Nora Wells did next is the kind of thing people talk about for years, like the video if you're already hooked and let me tell you everything. She had worked for Dominic Hale for 4 years, and in 4 years she had learned 3 things about him with absolute certainty. First, he was the most strategically brilliant person she had ever been in a room with. Second, he had no idea she knew that. Third, he had even less idea what she was. She had come to Hale Capital straight out of a master's program in financial economics, with a thesis her advisor had called the most rigorous piece of student work I have supervised in 22 years. She had taken the assistant position because it was the fastest way into the room where the decisions were made. And she had been patient, the way people are patient when they know exactly what they're waiting for. Dominic saw a woman who booked his flights and kept his calendar and made the coffee at exactly the right temperature. He saw someone efficient and invisible. He had never once asked where she went to school. He had, 3 days ago, lost a bet. The bet was with Reed Calloway, his oldest friend, his sharpest rival, and the man who had been trying to poach Dominic's seat on the Aldridge Capital Board for the better part of 2 years. The terms were simple and stupid. The way bets between competitive men always are, Dominic had claimed at a late dinner with too much whiskey on the table, that he could walk into the Aldridge annual board dinner with any woman in his orbit and command the room. Reed had laughed and said the room couldn't be commanded by a man who brought his own furniture. Bring your secretary, Reed had said. Bring the one with the notebook. I'll give you 48 hours to prepare her, and if she doesn't embarrass you inside the first 10 minutes, I'll back your expansion proposal with my full proxy votes. All 7 of them. 7 proxy votes, enough to push the Singapore acquisition through the board without opposition. $62 million in projected returns over 3 years. Dominic had shaken his hand before he finished the sentence. Nora had found out the next morning. Not from Dominic, from Reed's assistant, who told her with a slightly guilty energy of someone delivering a message they know is unkind. He said to tell you that you'll need to look presentable. His word. Presentable, she had sat with that word for exactly 4 minutes. Then she had picked up her phone and made 3 calls. What Dominic Hale did not know, what no one in that building knew, was that Nora Wells had a life entirely outside the one she performed at his office. Her mother had been a couture seamstress who dressed women for galas and state dinners and film premieres for 30 years. And Nora had grown up in the back of her atelier, learning the exact grammar of how a woman occupies a room. She knew what silk did differently from satin. She knew the precise heel height that changed a walk from movement into statement. She knew how to enter a space. She had simply chosen, for 4 years, not to. She called her mother. She called a woman named Ephioma, who had been her roommate in graduate school and now ran the most quietly celebrated styling practice in the financial district. And she called her own bank account, the one she had been adding to carefully and consistently for 4 years. And she made a decision. Not about the dinner, about what came after it. The Aldridge Capital Board dinner was held in the private dining room of the Beaumont Club. 42 people, 5 courses, and the particular thick silence of a room full of power that has nothing left to prove. The board members arrived in a cluster between 7 and 7:30. Their spouses arrived with them, polished and rehearsed, wearing the right things in the right way, performing a kind of elegant predictability. Dominic arrived at 7:18 with Reed at his elbow and 5 board members in tow, and he looked around for Nora with the vague impatience of a man checking whether his umbrella had made it into the car. She wasn't there yet. "Clock's running," Reed said pleasantly. Dominic checked his watch. Checked the door. Checked his watch again. At 7:24, the door opened. The room didn't stop. It just redistributed, the way a room does when something enters it that changes the geometry. Heads turned in the particular slow sequence of people who are trying not to be seen looking. Nora Wells walked in wearing a dress the color of deep amber, architectural at the shoulder, simple at the hem, and cut with a kind of precision that does not announce itself but is immediately understood. She found Dominic's eyes across the room. She walked to him, and the first thing she noticed, with a small internal satisfaction she allowed herself precisely once, was that Reed Calloway had stopped laughing. "You're late," Dominic said, low. "I'm exactly on time," she said. "You were early because you were nervous." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not slowly, not gracefully, but with the abrupt, slightly undignified quality of a man whose brain has just been handed information his expression hasn't caught up to yet. "Nora." His voice came out differently than he intended. "Dominic," she said, and she smiled. Not the professional, attentive smile she had worn for 4 years, but a different one. The real one. "Shall we go in?" The dinner was 5 courses in 3 hours, and Nora Wells spent them being exactly who she was. She had forgotten, or perhaps had simply set aside, how fluent she was in this language. She talked with the chair of the Aldridge Risk Committee about the Basel IV fee capital requirements, with the easy precision of someone who had spent a semester studying nothing else. She talked with the head of the Singapore desk about the regulatory environment in the Asian corridor, and watched the woman's eyes sharpen with genuine interest. She told a story about her thesis. Just once, just briefly, just enough, and watched 3 people at the table lean forward at the same moment. Dominic sat beside her and said almost nothing. He was watching her the way you watch something you thought you understood and are now understanding differently. Like a map you've been reading upside down for 4 years and have just turned over. Reed Calloway, 4 seats down, was very quiet. At the 3rd course, one of the senior board members, a man named Whitmore, who had been with Aldridge for 20 years and had the impassive, carefully maintained authority of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform, leaned across the table and said to Nora, "Where did Dominic find you?" She smiled. "I've been in his office for 4 years." Whitmore looked at Dominic. Dominic looked at his wine glass. Said Whitmore. And the single syllable contained an entire verdict. After the 4th course, Reed excused himself from the table. Dominic watched him go, then turned to Nora. "You have a master's degree," he said. Not a question. "In financial economics," she said. "Yes, from where?" "Warwick. My thesis was on liquidity risk pricing in cross-border acquisition structures." She paused 1 beat. which is directly relevant to the Singapore proposal you've been trying to push through the board for 7 months. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Why? Dominic said slowly. Have you been filing my expense reports? Because you never asked me to do anything else, she said. Simply, without accusation. Just the plain, quiet truth of it. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. And in the space between them, something was rearranging itself. 4 years of assumption. 4 years of her invisible competence. 4 years of a man who had been holding a resource he thought was furniture. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe me a promotion, she said. He laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, the kind of laugh that happens before a person can perform it. She had not heard it before. It turned out she liked it. Reed returned from wherever he had gone and settled back into his seat with the careful composure of a man who has had a private conversation he is not going to discuss. He picked up his wine. He looked at Nora. He looked at Dominic. The proxy votes, he said, are yours. I know, said Dominic. I wasn't talking to you, said Reed. He was looking at Nora. I was saying it to her, because she's the reason you won. The table went quiet. Dominic put down his fork. Nora folded her hands in her lap and said nothing, because nothing was exactly the right response, and she had always known when to let a room do the work. The woman seated to Reed's right, a sleek, watchful presence named Vivienne, who had arrived on his arm and had spent the first 2 courses performing the careful indifference of someone very aware of being observed, had been silent for most of the evening. Now she set her wine down. She looked at Reed. You bet on her, Vivienne said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the flat, clinical clarity of someone who has finally identified what they're looking at. You used her as a chip. Reed opened his mouth. Don't. Vivienne picked up her clutch from the back of her chair. She looked at him with an expression that had nothing warm in it. I've watched you treat capable people like props for 3 years. I kept thinking it would change. She stood. It didn't. She looked at Nora. One brief, direct look, the kind that passes between women who understand each other across a crowded room, and gave a small, precise nod. Then, she walked out of the dining room without looking back at Reed. Reed sat very still. The table watched him. He reached for his wine. His hand wasn't entirely steady. The senior board member, Whitmore, cleared his throat once. That was all. But in a room like that one, a cleared throat from a man like Whitmore is its own complete sentence, and every person at the table heard every word of it. Reed Calloway looked. For the first time in the 4 years Nora had known him by reputation, genuinely small. After the dinner, in the marble foyer while coats were being collected and goodbyes performed, Dominic found her by the window. He had the look of a man who had been rehearsing something. She had seen that look on enough executives to recognize it. Say what you're going to say, she said. I want to offer you a role, he said. Director of Strategic Analysis. You'd report directly to me. Salary commensurate with the seniority, retroactive review of your last 4 years, he stopped. That last part was Whitmore's suggestion, actually. He pulled me aside after dessert. I know, she said. He told me first. Dominic stared at her. He asked me, she said, whether I intended to stay with Hale Capital or whether I was going to take the offer he'd heard Aldridge's Singapore desk was planning to make me. She watched his face process that. Watched the calculation run. Watched it arrive. I told him I hadn't decided yet. The foyer was emptying. The last of the board members moved through the doors into the cold night air, their voices fading into the kind of satisfied quiet that follows a dinner that has gone well. Dominic stood in the marble light and looked at the woman who had been in his office for 4 years, and whom he had, for 4 years, entirely failed to see. Nora. His voice had changed again. It had lost the executive register, the performance of authority he wore so naturally she wasn't sure he knew he was wearing it. What was underneath was more uncertain, more honest. "I'm sorry. I know," she said, for the 3rd time that evening. "I mean it. I know that too." She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "The Singapore proposal. The liquidity risk assessment that's been stalling the board approval, it has a structural flaw in the cross-border collateral modeling. I identified it 8 weeks ago. It's fixable, but it needs to be fixed before the vote or Whitmore will kill it, regardless of the proxy support." Dominic blinked. "You found a flaw in the model your senior analyst built?" "Yes, I've been waiting for someone to ask." He looked at her for a very long time. "Come back to the office," he said. "Tonight, let me see it." She considered him, this man who had walked past her for 4 years, who had caught a door in her face without noticing, who had looked at her in the hotel corridor and said, "You'll do." And she made the decision she had already made 3 days ago, the one that had nothing to do with the bet and everything to do with the future she had been patient enough to build. "Yes," she said, "but we're taking separate cars. And tomorrow morning, I want the offer in writing before I open my laptop." He almost smiled. "Done." And Dominic. She picked up her coat from the attendant. "The next time someone in your orbit does something remarkable, ask them where they went to school." She walked through the door first. He held it open this time. She noticed. She didn't say anything. But she noticed. The Singapore acquisition was approved at a special board session 6 weeks later, with all 7 of Reed Calloway's proxy votes and the revised collateral model that Nora had rebuilt over 4 consecutive late nights, and presented to the full board with a composure that made 2 members of the risk committee quietly request copies of her analysis. The vote was unanimous. The projected return over 3 years was $62 million, and the model that made it possible had been sitting in an assistant's head for 8 weeks, waiting to be asked. Dominic stood up in the boardroom when the vote was announced and looked across the table at Nora, now seated at it, not behind it, and he said, loudly enough for every person in the room to hear, "This acquisition exists because of the work of our new director of strategic analysis. I want that on the record." Whitmore wrote it down himself. Reed was not in the room. He had quietly withdrawn his board membership the week after the Beaumont dinner. Vivienne, it emerged, had not gone back to his apartment that night. She had gone home to pack. She was, by the time the Singapore vote was called, 3 time zones away and building something of her own. 2 years later, on a Tuesday evening in late October, Nora Wells stood in the back garden of a townhouse in the part of the city where the light comes through the trees, in long gold slants in the autumn, wearing something simple and white, with Dominic's hand in hers and a look on her face that the photographer would later describe as a woman who already knew how the story ended. In the front row, her mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular expression of a woman who has spent 30 years dressing other people for their most important moments and is now watching her daughter arrive at hers. 3 months after the wedding, Nora's thesis, the one her advisor had called the most rigorous student work in 22 years, was cited in a Financial Times analysis of cross-border acquisition risk modeling as a decade ahead of mainstream practice. She read the article on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, her feet tucked beneath her on the office sofa, the autumn light coming through the window, Dominic reading quietly beside her. She had always been worth this. She had simply been the only one in the room who already knew it. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the building is the one nobody thought to ask. If this story landed somewhere real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.